Dust hung low over Ash Hollow that morning, thick as smoke and heavy as judgment. It clung to the wooden facades of the saloon and the mercantile, drifted in the cracks of hitching rails, and settled in the hair of the townsfolk who gathered in a slow, shifting circle. Their faces were pale, not from pity but from the shame of watching and doing nothing. Martha Keating's dress was torn, crusted with blood at the hem. Her hair stuck to her face in damp ropes, and her eyes looked out at nothing, as if the sky itself had vanished. Virgil Crowder's hand was twisted in her arm, dragging her across the dirt like a mule-hide sack. She staggered, knees buckling, her body still raw from labor. Behind her, the wind carried the faintest, thinnest cry, her child's cry coming from the stall she had been ripped from. Virgil spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Debt's paid, and she's mine," he barked, loud enough for the whole street to hear. His voice carried the tone of a man who believed the town itself was his. No one answered. Boots shifted, but no man stepped forward. The silence was thicker than the dust, heavier than the August heat. Martha's mind spun, but not with words, only fragments. The feel of straw under her cheek, the warmth of the infant's skin as she pressed it once to her breast, the tearing pain that split her body hours before, and now this. Being hauled into daylight like some beast unfit for shade. Her breath came in short gasps. She thought, wildly, of the Platte River she'd crossed weeks ago, the prairie stretching endless on both sides. She remembered thinking then that the land could break a person, grind them down until nothing was left but grit in the teeth. She hadn't known it would be men who did the breaking. A horse shifted near the trough, its hooves clicking against the plank walk. The sound seemed to stir something at the edge of the crowd. Calder Boone sat astride a gray gelding, hat brim pulled low, scar catching a slant of sun across his cheek. He had ridden into town for salt and beans, but what he found was a woman bleeding into the dust while the town kept its head bowed. He watched Virgil shove her forward, watched her stumble to her knees. The memory of another woman flashed quick as lightning, his own wife, pale and coughing in their bed while fever ate her lungs. That memory came with the smell of boiled herbs and loss, and he clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. Martha lifted her head once, just enough to meet Calder's eyes. It wasn't a plea, it was emptiness, the look of a soul that had already been declared forfeit. He felt it hit his chest like a hammer. Virgil jerked her arm again. "Ain't nobody's business but mine," he growled, looking around for challenge. None came, not from the blacksmith, not from the sheriff sipping whiskey 2 doors down. Calder's hand brushed the stock of his Winchester. He did not draw, not yet. The war had taught him the weight of pulling iron too soon, but he nudged his gelding forward, slow, until his shadow fell over Martha and Virgil both. The crowd shifted again, uneasy now. "You done with her, Crowder?" Calder's voice was low, cracked like leather left too long in sun. Virgil turned, surprised. His lip curled when he saw the scar. "Ain't your concern, soldier. Take your war ghosts elsewhere." Calder studied him, eyes unreadable. The wind stirred dust between them. He thought of his rifle barrel flashing blue over Gettysburg Fields, thought of the men who fell without names. He thought, too, of how this woman would join them in the earth if someone didn't stand between her and the man who called her property. Martha felt the shift, though she dared not hope. Her arm throbbed where Virgil gripped her. Her body ached with emptiness where her child had been. But there was something in the way the stranger's voice cut the air like a line drawn in dirt before a duel. Calder dismounted without hurry. He tied his reins to the rail, set his boots solid in the dust. He didn't raise his rifle. He only looked at Virgil long enough that the silence grew unbearable. Virgil spat again, but the angle of his shoulders changed. He shoved Martha once more, harder than needed, and let go. "Keep her then," he said with a sneer. "Won't be the first time you picked up another man's leavings." He turned, whistled for his horse, and swung into the saddle. His men followed, laughter trailing like spurs, jingling in mockery. When the dust settled, only Martha and Calder stood in the open street. The crowd drifted back into doorways, eager to forget what they'd seen. Calder bent, offered a hand. She hesitated, staring at it as though it were another trap. Then, with the last of her strength, she let him lift her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air smelled of gun oil and horse sweat, of dust that would never leave a man's lungs. Martha leaned against him, her vision dimming, the echo of her baby's cry still lodged in her ears. Calder looked toward the north road, where Virgil's riders had vanished in a haze of grit. His scar burned in the sun. He knew this wasn't finished, not by half. And as he guided Martha toward his waiting horse, he understood that the silence of Ash Hollow was a silence that would demand blood before it was broken. They hadn't gone a mile north of town before. Calder noticed the extra cuts in the road, fresh shod prints paralleling his gelding's stride. One hind shoe chipped to a crescent. Not close, but steady. A man could follow like that and never show his face. He kept his eyes on the country and let the nag carry their weight. Martha slumped against him, light as a half-empty sack, hot as a stove door. The afternoon lay down flat across the prairie. Light came mean and bright, the way it does after noon when the wind dies and the dust just hangs. Cottonwoods marked the draw where his place hid. Leaves turned silver in the faintest breath. Somewhere to the west, a hawk spoke once. Then the world went quiet again, save for tack creak and hoofbeats and the small sound from Martha's throat when the horse jolted. He put a calloused hand against her shoulder to steady her and felt the fever climbing. Her dress was stiff with blood and stable filth. He smelled her fear through it, and underneath that, the old stink of horse and Irontown airs, false and hard. The war had crowded his nose with worse, but there was a way pain shared the same room, no matter the address. He tipped his canteen and let a thread of water find her lips. She drank without looking at him, eyes open to a distance he could not measure. "You got a name?" His voice came quiet, shaped by miles. She worked her mouth. "Martha," she said, as if it hurt to pull the word through her teeth. "All right," he said. "You hold on." The country rolled under them like baked muscle buffalo grass, cut to the quick. Sand patches, old wagon grooves ghosting toward the Platte. The gelding knew the trail, carried them along the low swell and down into the draw. A windmill stood above the sod roof of his cabin, its vanes squealing once like a scold. The pump jack clacked slow. Everything out here had its own sound, and every sound had a story if you'd lived long enough to learn it. He swung down in the yard and caught her before she fell. Up close, her eyes were wrong bright, her skin burning and shivering at once, breath short as a struck match. Postpartum fever, he didn't know the word for it. Only the way it took a woman like a late frost takes blossom. He got the door open with his boot and shouldered inside. The cabin held cool shade, and the smell of wood smoke ground into every board. A saddle, a rifle rack, a table built low and plain. He laid her on the bed and set a quilt over her, then went to the pump and worked the handle until the pail filled with water so cold it could bite a man. He tore strips from a clean flour sack and made compresses. One for her brow, one for the neck, one for the bent hollow of each arm where heat pooled. Her eyes slid toward him, then away. He remembered to turn his face a little, out of habit, so the scar didn't sit full on her. The skin ran from cheekbone to jaw, like a seam left by a dull knife, the old surgeon in the field saying, "Hold him, boys," while the blade did what the bullet started. He had stopped feeling it years back, but other folks still had to learn it. The kettle hung from its crane over the coals. He fed the fire with chips and waited for the water to talk. He'd keep it low steam and warm, not rolling. He dropped in willow bark and a thumb of ginger he kept for colds. You did what you could with what you had. He pulled a tin cup from its nail and set it to the side, then cleaned his hands and the knife and saw to her wrists where Virgil's grip had raised welts. Gentle work, clumsy in his big hands, careful all the same. After a while, she tried to rise. He set a hand to her shoulder and she flinched, then forced herself to be still. She swallowed. "The baby." "I know," he said. He didn't, not yet. He waited. "I left her." Someone came. The words were smoke leaking through a crack. "Blue blanket. Wasn't mine." He glanced down at the floor, then at her sleeve. A small thread of cloth had tangled there. Not from her dress blue calico with a white stitch, neat and small. The kind of work a woman makes in good light with time enough to do it right. He worked it free with his big fingers. On the corner lay one letter in faded thread. S. He didn't show her the scrap. Not then. He slid it into his vest pocket and stood in the doorway to the yard. The windmill gave a small kick. Out past the cottonwoods, the sky was a hard, merciless blue, and the country ran on and on. He could not see dust on the horizon now, but the hoofprints on the road behind his mind stayed just where they'd been alongside, patient, not going anywhere. He went back and sat on the stool. "Drink this," he said, and held the cup to her mouth. The willow tasted like medicine and creek water and something old. She grimaced, but she drank, and he saw some of the heat leave her face like a cloud pulling off the sun. "I can pay you," she said later, rough with shame, as if a price could be put on breathing. "I can work." "Not now," he said. "Now you rest." The blanket on the bed had been his wife's. He had not pulled it down since the day he put the last of her things away. When the fever took her so quick, he never learned the right prayer to say. The memory came, not loud, but it settled its hand on his shoulder and pressed. He let it. In war, you learned what you could not keep. Out here, a man might learn it slower. He lit the lamp and trimmed the wick until it made a small, honest circle of light. Evening came the way it always did on the plains fast, like a door closing. Shadows carried the smell of chilled dirt and iron. Coyotes sketched themselves in yips miles off. He checked the Winchester and laid it across the table, worked the action once to hear the clean, oiled sound. He loaded the Navy revolver and set it near the lamp. He left the door on the latch, not the lock. Locks in this country were like bad promises. Her breathing steadied. Once, without seeming to wake, she said, "Did she cry long?" He swallowed. "I don't know," he said, "but I reckon someone heard." He took his hat and stepped out. The night wind had a knife to it. Stars lifted cold beyond the windmill blades, and the creek up there ticked like a slow clock. He crouched and studied the ground by habit. No fresh sign in the yard, no stray prints at the well. He walked to the edge of the draw and listened. The prairie will talk if you honor its silence. He heard a rider somewhere far east. Or maybe he only heard the memory of a rider. The war had a way of making every sound ride back to you in the same saddle. Inside, he poured a finger of whiskey and let it sit in his mouth until the heat ran down. He took the blue scrap from his vest and turned it in the lamplight. The stitching was fine, the S plain. He thought through the town. Stevens the livery man, no wife. Sheriff Sims, never married. Sullivan old widow with a hen house and a mean goose. Bakes bread on Sundays and sits by the front of the church she never goes in. He remembered seeing her eyes once, tasting the air like a coyote at the edge of a yard where trouble stood. If a child cried in that stall, she'd have heard. She had a way of hearing what she needed. The mystery settled around him the way the dust had earlier. He did not know if Virgil's chipped shoe had been the one shadowing him or some other hand. He did not know if the town's silence would crack or hold. He only knew the sun would climb again, and he'd ride in at first light and ask the right questions in a voice that carried no apology. He banked the coals, checked the rifle once more, and sat with his back to the wall where a man could see the door and the window both. The lamp burned low, and the room filled with the small breathing of the woman on the bed. For a long time, he didn't move. The night put its weight on the cabin, and the cabin held. When sleep came, it came mean and shallow, the way it does for men who wait on footsteps. He dreamed of a field far back, and a white sheet carried on 2 rifles, a wind that smelled like iron, a cry he could not place. He woke with his hand already on the gun, the moon laying a pale square on the floorboards, and in that quiet square he thought he heard a baby somewhere, or a coyote, or a life he'd already lost circling back for another try. At first light, he found the sign by the well one hind shoe pressed a clean crescent in the powder, chipped just so, and it hadn't been there at midnight. The print pointed toward the road and then away, as if a man had ridden close, thought better, and let the prairie take his doubt back with him. Calder crouched until his knee ground the grit, set 2 fingers in the mark, and felt the cooled rim where iron met hardpan. The windmill creaked once above him and fell quiet, like a witness holding its breath. Martha woke to the soft clink of tin and the smell of coffee gone thin. Fever still worked under her skin, but it no longer burned like it meant to finish her. When she tried to push up, strength left her arms like water leaving a bucket with a hole. He steadied her with an elbow and put the cup to her mouth. "I'll ride in," he said, eyes on the door while he spoke. "Back before the sun climbs high." Her gaze moved to the window, the square of morning that promised nothing. "If," she stopped and swallowed. If she's there, I'll find her," he said. Then after a beat, "I expect she is." He left the Winchester locked down across the saddle and rode the gray at an easy trot. The country smelled like old ash and sagebrush warming up for heat, the kind of air that searched a man's scars without asking leave. The sky came on hard and blue as enamel, and the roads showed what roads always show a record of who owned courage and who owned time. He watched for the crescent chip and saw it now and then, angling along, never quite catching up with itself. Ash Hollow wasn't awake so much as it was standing guard over its own silence. The sheriff's office door sat open to a chair tipped back and nobody in it. A cat crossed the street like it had business. Calder turned down the lane where the cottonwoods grew thick, and Widow Sullivan kept her coop and her stubborn white goose that hated every boot but hers. He caught the lullaby first thin as thread through cloth, more breath than tune. It stopped when his gelding shoes rattled a loose board. The goose hissed and stretched its neck like a preacher pointing at sin. Calder swung down, tied loose, and kept his hands where a woman could see them. "Morning, ma'am," he said toward the doorway, not too loud. "Wind's working up for heat." "Wind's always working up for something," she answered from the shade. He could see her shape, spare and straight, a shawl crossed at her chest, one hand on the jamb like she meant to keep the world from pushing past her. He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Boone. Calder Boone." "I know who you are," she said. "War took half our boys and gave back a handful of men and a few wolves. You're one of the men." He let that pass. The goose settled by picking at dirt, still watching him like it would file a report later. From somewhere inside the house, he heard a sound so small it might have been nothing. Then it came again, rounder, human. "I heard tell," he said, easy and flat. "That trouble pitched a fit in Crowder's stable yesterday. Sound carries." "Sound carries," she said. "And then it quits. Sometimes it quits because someone listened." She didn't move for a time. He waited where he was. A fly hummed, neared, and changed its mind. Out on the prairie, a cow bawled like an empty drum. Widow Sullivan stepped forward so he could see her face. Whittled by weather, eyes clear as creek water in shade. She looked at his scar, then at his hands, then past him to the street, like she was measuring how much town he had dragged here in his wake. She opened the door wider. "You will not touch her," she said in a voice that put the law back into the gospel. "You'll see her, and then you'll leave proper, and you won't say her name where a crow can carry it." He followed 2 steps and stopped at the threshold. The room smelled of yeast and lye soap and something sweet that wasn't a thing but a presence. A blue blanket lay in a basket by the hearth. White stitches, neat as fence posts. He saw the corner and the letter set there in pale thread, S. Same hand as the scrap in his vest. The baby slept curled like a comma in a sentence yet to be finished. He'd forgotten that a child could be so small and still take up a house. "Who brought her?" he asked. "Nobody you need point a gun at," she said. "Night fell drunk. I heard a cry and found that stall like a battlefield. I took what didn't belong to the dust. Virgil will say she belongs to him. Virgil says a lot of things." Widow Sullivan went to the basket and did nothing but stand near it, as if standing was work enough. He sent a boy by after dawn, asked questions that looked like answers. Shoe on the bay he rode had a nick out of it, left a mark like a moon with a bite. Boy looked at nothing when he talked. That's a bad habit to raise a child on. Calder filed the news where a man keeps the pieces he'll need. He let his eyes rest on the child only long enough to know the shape of her breathing. He pictured Martha's hands empty and her eyes gone to slender glass. "You'll keep her for now," he said, not a question. "She'll be kept," the widow said. "But the right mother has to lay claim with her eyes open and something in her hands besides sorrow. You bring that woman when she can stand without the world holding her up." He nodded. He thought to say thank you and discovered the word had worn thin somewhere on the march home years ago. He tipped his hat instead. The goose followed him to the gate like a hired guard and hissed again for the record. He took the long way to the mercantile and bought flour and salt and a spool of thread the exact shade of the blanket's blue. On impulse, he bought a length of muslin soft enough to be a second skin. The shopgirl wrapped the lot without speaking. Folks in Ash Hollow had learned that talk could spin a noose. Before he rode out, he turned once more down the lane and saw a face at the window, just a flash, a flicker, like heat over a road. It wasn't the widow, it wasn't the baby. It was some old part of loss peering back at him from the glass. He shook it off and found the road. The ride home set the sun on his left shoulder. Heat rose from the ground and carried the dry smell of gun oil he'd rubbed into the bolt the night before. Far off, a rider ghosted a ridge and then was not there. He found the crescent print again south of his place, fresher now, as if someone had come and gone twice just to prove he could. Martha was sitting up when he walked in, hair braided back by a hand that had remembered how, without asking. Color had returned to her mouth in a thin slash. She looked at him like a man might be a rope or a blade, useful either way. "Well?" Her voice trembled, but only in the tail end of the word. "She lives," he said. "She's fed and warm. Widow Sullivan has her." He watched the news hit her. Not like a shot, more like rain after months of none the ground doesn't cheer. It just drinks. Martha pressed her palms against her eyes and drew in a breath she hadn't allowed herself all day. Then she let them fall and looked past him, past the room, to some place where a road curved toward a door. "I can ride," she said. It wasn't true, not yet. But a lie like that wants to grow into the truth if a body gives it time. "Dusk," he said. "We'll go when the light lays low and the town looks away." She nodded once, sharp. He set a pot on and made a thin stew, tore the bread he'd brought and watched her eat it like a woman who had learned the hard arithmetic of taking and keeping. When the heat outside softened and the wind forgot to nag, he saddled the gray in his old mare and wrapped the muslin in the blue thread. They rode slow through the draw with crickets stitching the dark. The first lamps in town blinked like a handful of stars had fallen and got caught on eaves. They tied off in the alley and walked the last bit. Widow Sullivan's house sat with its windows holding the last of the day. They did not knock. The widow opened before they reached the step, as if she'd been listening to their shadows. She looked at Martha for a long breath. No one spoke. The goose, confounded, stayed quiet. 2 minutes, the widow said, and stood aside. Martha crossed the threshold as if the boards knew her weight already. The basket was where it had been. The baby had turned her head and found a fist to work. Martha stopped a foot away and did not reach. She didn't need to. Her body had already crossed whatever distance a room makes. Tears did not come. Some deserts keep their rain underground. Calder stayed in the doorway and watched the way silence made a cradle all its own. He saw Martha lower to her knees, saw the way her shoulders squared up under the work of being alive and present. The widow stood behind her like a fence that doesn't show off. When they stepped back out, the sky had taken on that tin color it wears before night admits what it means to do. Calder glanced down the lane and found one more crescent half-moon pressed in the dust and pointing west. And though the breeze moved and the air cooled, the print did not blur, and he knew a man could follow you without ever being seen until the day he decided you'd learned enough about what was coming. At dawn, the barn door stood a hand's width open, though Calder swore he'd dropped the latch. The split beam wore a new mark at hip height, a little gouge curved like a sliver of moon, the kind a horseshoe might leave if a man leaned his boot iron in pride. No prints showed on the hard yard but one, faint and careful, where dust had gathered in a seam and the heel had cut a shallow smile that matched the door. Calder ran his thumb along the splinter as if it could tell him the hour. He didn't curse. He went for a hammer and a longer hasp. Martha stood in the doorway with the blanket drawn around her shoulders. Eyes steady, jaw set like a nail. The sky behind her carried thin ribs of cloud. The air had the taste of iron and old milk. "We'll fix it," she said before he did. He nodded. "We'll fix it," he said, and set the new iron with slow, deep strikes. The sound rang through the morning like a church bell without a steeple. They started work after coffee and a swallow of broth. The barn had been a stall for 3 seasons. Too many manure, dried to brick and straw, turned to mouse nest dust. Calder pitched the worst of it to a low heap, while Martha boiled lye in a kettle big as a washtub. Steam rose and found the rafters. The smell of ash and smoke, of old animal and clean burn, filled the place until it felt like something was being forgiven plank by plank. She scrubbed on her knees with a rag wrapped around a stick, pushing the gray water toward the door. Each stroke lifted a little darkness and set it running into sunlight. Splinters caught her palms, and she welcomed the sting. It told her what had been taken from her hands was coming back by inches. When she sat back to breathe, she did it with her eyes closed so she could count the air and know she was earning it. Calder pried a warped window from the south wall. He'd brought a sash from the junk pile behind the mercantile, glass wavy and flawed as creek ice. But it would hold light and keep wind. He squared the frame with a plane that sang in that small way planes do. Curl after curl of pine peeled off and stacked at his boots, like shavings of some old life he could not use no more. Martha watched how he set the corners true, tight, quiet. Work has its own manners, and he minded everyone. They rested at noon with their backs to a beam. The windmill out front squeaked a tune that never found a second line. Flies thumped the new glass and gave up. From across the draw, a horse walked slow along the ridge. Rider slouched to look like brush, then turned and ghosted away. Calder did not comment. He handed Martha a crust dipped in grease, and the two of them ate like field hands who understood that food was just another tool. In the afternoon, she unrolled the muslin and cut it in straight lines on the table he dragged out. Her hands remembered faster than her head did. A seam ran crooked, then steadied. She threaded the needle with the blue he'd brought, a blue that matched the blanket she'd seen by the hearth, the blue that tied a letter to a name, S. She stroked the thread once between finger and thumb, and some part of her became still, like water when the wind drops. "You want these to hang easy," she said, not quite asking. "So when the heat gets mean, we can pull them and make shade." He nodded. "And so a body can see who comes before he knocks." She met his eyes. There was a thing neither of them said. Sometimes a man didn't knock. They set a potbelly stove in the corner, pipe running out where a wasp nest had been. Calder sealed the holes with mud and ash. The way his father had shown him with words he could still hear as if the man were standing behind him. The stove squatted like a black heart that might yet start up and bring heat to the bones of a new place. Martha rubbed the iron with grease until it shone. She wanted that shine. It was a small defiance, and she took it. He showed her the stack of split cedar he'd traded for planks enough to make 3 narrow beds and a cradle. He didn't say cradle. He said a small bed, and his mouth did not quite carry the lie. She touched the wood and measured without measuring. "Not the fancy kind," he said. "The kind that lasts," she answered. She set pegs along a post with a mallet, each peg true enough to take a coat or a life if it needed to. She thought of the town, how its faces had turned away and then turned back. She thought of Widow Sullivan's voice standing straight as a picket. She thought of Virgil's laugh, wide and hollow as a tin pan, and something rose in her chest that wasn't fear and wasn't pride, just a steadiness, the way a rope hums when you pull it taut. Toward evening, a little wind came up and pushed dust through the high door, so the light went thick and gold. In that light, the motes hung and moved like a river slowed to the speed of heartbeat. Martha stopped and held her breath and listened, and in the hush she heard a hoof far off, a single clop where there should have been none, and she knew the chipped moon was still moving around them, patient as a debt that had not yet come due. "Fence the back run," Calder said, because saying a plain thing steadied a man. "I'll bring rails down in the morning." "I'll whitewash," she said. She meant to lime the lower half of the walls where hands would go and where a child would crawl. She meant to make a place that looked like a woman had chosen it. The thought startled her, then held her. They kept after it until the lamp was needed, and then kept after it a little more. The flames set the new glass to a low fire and threw their shadows long on the boards like two people bigger than themselves. Coyotes talked higher on the ridge. The smell of warm iron and drying pine and the last curl of lie drifted around them and set something quiet in the mind, though the world outside remained full of men who'd pry a door open by the heel of a shoe. Calder brought in 3 old chairs and a Bible with a torn cover someone had left behind in a move. He set them by the window for the morning sun. Martha spread the muslin across the frame, and when she smoothed it, her hands did not shake. She'd clean again at first light, and after that she'd start bread, even if it failed, even if the yeast sulked, she'd start. Place needs smell and habit before it will call itself by a new name. When they finally stepped into the yard, the air had gone cool enough to lift the hair on their arms. The windmill ticked a slow gossip with the stars. Calder checked the latch he'd built and set a bell on a wire above it. It was a small bell, the sort used for cows. It would not stop a man. It would simply tell the truth about his coming. He walked Martha to the cabin. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the barn. No, not a barn now, not entirely. Something in her laid claim without legal paper or town law. The baby slept in a house, not yet hers, and the moon rose thin as a shaving of bone, and somewhere on the road, a rider pressed his heel into iron and learned another thing about the sound a new door makes when you test it. By the time the lamp threw its square of light upon the muslin, the place had the beginning of a roofed heart, and the knight stood just beyond the window, listening like a man who had not yet decided if he came to buy or to burn. He found the cartridge standing upright on the muslin sill like a candle stub. .44 rimfire. Unfired. Somebody had set it there and walked away. The brass smelled faintly of coin and old smoke, as if it had borrowed a memory from a different shot. Calder turned it between thumb and forefinger, felt the soft dent where a thumbnail had worried the rim, and put it in his vest. The bell over the latch hadn't rung in the night, or else he'd slept past it. Either way, a man had come close enough to breathe on the glass. Martha was already outside with the lime bucket. Whitewash crawled up the lower boards like new skin. She worked slow, steady strokes. The light ran along the brush and made the wet wood shine for a moment before it dulled. He showed her the cartridge. Her eyes found it and stayed there. She didn't ask what it meant. Meaning had stopped needing words in this country. "Town will be talking," he said. "I'll ride in and see which talk matters." She nodded and set the brush back to the wall. He watched the muscles in her forearm tighten and ease. They'd built a place where a bell would tell the truth. It would not keep the truth out. He saddled the gray and went at a canter that looked lazy and wasn't. Ash Hollow wore mourning like a man wears a shirt after a beating buttoned, but tender across the ribs. The street held more eyes than voices. On the church steps, 3 women kept their heads together so close their bonnets might have been stitched. The sheriff leaned in his doorway with a lawman's slouch and a drinker's face. Calder reigned near the smithy. The forge breathed hot iron and coal smoke. Stevens, the liveryman, was there jawing with the blacksmith over a hind shoe with a crescent chip. The blacksmith lifted it with tongs. "Asked to reset it clean," he said without looking up. Said the chip made his bay limp in sand. "Funny thing, a chip like that leaves a mark everywhere a man shouldn't be." "Who brought it?" Calder asked. Stevens pinched snuff and found something interesting in the road dust. "Boy I ain't seen before," he said. "Hat too big for his head, rode like the saddle was borrowed." Calder let it settle. A boy would do for errands a man might be judged for. The blacksmith set the shoe down with a clank like a door, shutting a room on its secrets. At the mercantile, the girl behind the counter wrapped caps in tobacco with hands that had been taught not to shake. "Men came early," she said, quiet as a prayer, bought rope and lamp fuel, and laughed about neither. Her eyes flicked to his scar and away. "You shouldn't be here alone." "I ain't been alone in years," he said, and paid for flour. He didn't need just to hear coin touch wood. He felt the saloon before he saw it, cool shadow smelling of whiskey and old varnish, notes of gun oil climbing out of somebody's coat. The piano had lost a key, and every tune limped. Calder stepped inside, and the conversation bent around him like grass around a rock. At the back, under a map so faded the rivers ran like scars, Fitch Crowder, the foreman Virgil used when he wanted to look respectable, sat with 2 riders in the noon sun at his back. Fitch had a face like a sharpened shovel and hands too clean for a man who claimed to work. "Boone," Fitch said, smiling in a way that let nothing soften. "I heard you've been collecting what ain't yours." Calder kept the Winchester on his shoulder and his hat low. "I've been mending what needed mending." "That woman needed mending?" Fitch tossed his whiskey and set the glass down on a wet ring like a target. "Virgil says she's paid for and accounted." Calder could hear the room lean forward. He could also hear his heartbeat find that slow, mean rhythm. A soldier learns nothing fast, nothing to waste. He set the rifle against the bar, far enough to show he wouldn't make a fool out of anybody, and close enough to make a liar if he had to. "She's got a name," he said. "You can use it or not, talk at all." Fitch chuckled, a dry scrape. "Names don't change paper. Paper don't change iron." Around them, glasses clicked soft as insects. The barkeep polished one spot of oak until it shone like a lie. Somebody at the far table half rose and then remembered the day and sat again. Fitch stood slow. His hand brushed his belt and stopped where the pistol hung with an air of having seen more talk than use. Calder stayed still. He could feel every eye in the room reach for the same answer. He had learned what killing did to a house. He had learned it twice. He held still longer than was comfortable. Fitch smiled bigger, like a man who just won a hand without cards. "Tell your stray she's got 2 days to come home," he said. "Virgil's book keeps time." Calder picked up his rifle and left without turning his back. The sun hit him hard enough to make him squint, and the heat off the street rose up to tell him he'd kept a fight from starting and started something else instead. Widow Sullivan was sweeping her stoop like she meant to clean the day itself. The blue blanket lay folded on the chair inside, corner turned just enough to show the letter stitched there. S. She looked at him and then at the line the saloon had left on his face. "Heard you said a woman's name in there," she murmured. "Good. Somebody had to." "Town will choose," he said. "Town already did," she said, and her broom made a sound like grass when it burns. He rode back the long way, past the schoolhouse and the graveyard with its white stones leaning as if the wind had a vote. He saw, on the edge of the road, a splash of oil where it shouldn't be fresh, coal black, the kind that slings off a clean gun. He smelled it before he saw it, a penny metal tang that put Gettysburg in his mouth. He followed the stain 2 lengths and lost it where the dust went to powder. Somewhere, a rider turned back into brush and became nobody again. At the draw, he paused and watched his own place before he rode in. No smoke but his, no shadow but a crow's. The bell over the latch sat quiet, the wire pulled an inch tauter than he remembered. Martha was on a chair, muslin curtains in her lap, needle traveling a straight road. The whitewash had turned matte and clean. Her sleeves were shoved above her elbows, and the sun had put a brown on her that looked like resolve. He told her about the saloon. He told her about the shoe. He did not tell her that some piece of him had wanted Fitch to try him, if only because wanting is easier to carry when it has a shape you can put down. "We'll finish the cradle," she said. He didn't correct the word. The evening leaned in, soft as it ever was out here, which is to say not soft at all. He set rails for the back run and listened to the land. In the yard, he hammered a small cross brace and felt, through the palm of his hand, the tremor of hoofbeats traveling the ground from a mile away. Sound comes early on the plains and carries the news of men who haven't yet admitted they're coming. They ate in the door where the breeze could find them. Widow Sullivan's bread held the house together with its smell. Coyotes began to write their thin letters across the ridge. When the lamp was lit, the muslin made a square of light in the dark that could be seen from the road. Calder went and drew it half closed. A square like that is an invitation if you've made enemies who mistake warmth for weakness. They did not speak of leaving, they spoke of pegs and quilts and what color the trim ought to be. And while they spoke, the night gathered itself and laid down just beyond the fence. When the first star took hold, the bell above the latch sounded one thin note and then no more. Calder stood with his hand at the rifle and waited until the wind said it had been only the wind. Somewhere west, a horse blew out and settled, and he could not say if the sound came from a real mouth or from the road that kept running through his head. He set the cartridge on the table and turned down the lamp. In the dark, he heard the deep wood of the place speak back to him. And what it said was simple as a ledger. You can make a house, you can call it by a new name, but the debt that brought you here will still come looking for your door. At sunup, the bell over the latch was wrong. The clapper had been wrapped with a scrap of cloth and tied off with blue thread the same shade as the blanket at Widow Sullivan's, the same color as the scrap in Calder's vest. It would still swing if pulled, but it wouldn't sing. A man had stood here in the dark, reached high, and taught their bell to keep a secret. He cut the thread with his knife and pocketed the cloth. The air was cool yet with the night's mercy, holding that faint iron smell the plains wear before heat burns it off. The windmill turned 2 slow blades and quit. Down in the draw, a magpie clacked, and then the morning went quiet enough to hear his own breath scratch his throat. Martha came from the barn with lime on her hands. She saw the mute bell, saw the thread in his fist, and did not ask. The line between asking and knowing had grown thin as wire out here. "We'll need water set in buckets," she said, "and cloth torn clean." He nodded. "Load the canteens. Put the lamp fuel away somewhere. A bullet can't find it." They worked without hurry. Haste wastes. He drew the Winchester and ran the lever slow, felt the bolt slide, felt the brass noses seat. He thumbed the Navy's cylinder and eased it down. The scent of gun oil stood up like a man. Outside, hooves spoke far off and then stopped, as if remembering something they didn't wish to say twice. By mid-morning, the dust to the east thickened. Not whine, this was the flat, rolling kind a herd makes when it comes on a rope. Calder wrapped the rifle sling around his forearm and stepped to the yard. Heat pushed the smell of sage and old ash off the ground. He tasted coin and smoke and a war he hadn't finished. Virgil Crowder came first, riding a bay with a new hind shoe set clean. The old chip moon had been thrown away like a lie that no longer served. Fitch Crowder rode to his right, hat tilted, hands neat as always. Behind them, a ragged string of men whose names didn't matter, guns, hired by the day and fed by the night. They fanned in a half circle, leaving the house its shadow. Virgil smiled with his teeth. "Morning, Boone." "Morning," Calder said. Fitch's eyes flicked to the new hasp on the barn, to the whitewash, to the bell whose tongue hung free again. His smile didn't move. "We left you a gift last night," he said. "Shame you took it down." "Bell ought to do what bells do," Calder said. "Women ought to do what women do," Virgil said lightly, and the men behind him made that small, low-sound men make when they favor a thing that shames them. "You've been nursing one that belongs to me." Calder didn't step forward. He didn't look back. "She doesn't belong." Virgil's reins creaked under his hand. "Everything belongs. That's why God gave us paper and bullets." Martha stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, sleeves rolled past the elbow. Her eyes were black coffee, dark and just as bitter this morning. She said nothing. The silence around her seemed to have edges. Fitch gave a show of patience, as if this were a fence dispute and not a matter of flesh. "We'll be decent about it," he said. "Town likes decent. You bring the woman in, and Virgil will set his claim in front of men who can write their names. If you won't, we can do it here with the same result and less expense." Calder watched a dragonfly try the heat and change its mind. He watched the way the riders' horses stood ears forward, but not skittish. Men who had told him what to be afraid of. He heard Martha's breath steady at his back. "You want decent?" he said. "We'll make it decent. Street in Ash Hollow. You and me, Virgil. No boys, no lies. Sun when it's highest, so shadows don't cheat. Town can look or not. I don't much care." Virgil licked his teeth and grinned. "Boy wants a picture show." He turned in the saddle so his voice would carry. "Hear that, Fitch? Army man wants to teach us about fairness." He faced Calder again and nodded. "Tomorrow, when a man can't hide in his own shade." Fitch's jaw made a small tick, like a clock remembering it's late. "We do it under the sheriff's eyes," he said, "to give the day a coat that would pass as Sunday clothes." "You tell the sheriff," Calder said. Virgil leaned closer on his horn. His breath had whiskey in it and something older. "You could make this easy," he said, just for the two of them. "You could ease her back into the world where she belongs." Calder looked at the scarred knuckles on Virgil's hand, then at the open palm of the day. "I'm through with easy," he said. One of the riders let his horse sidle toward the bell and pluck it with his bit. The clapper chimed, bright and honest. The men laughed not much, but enough. Virgil gathered his reins and wheeled his bay. "Sunday high," he said again. "Don't be late. I don't like to wait to win." They left the way a storm leaves without apology, dust settling in the prints like loose ash in a graveside shovel. When the last hoofbeat sank, Calder found he had not breathed for a count of 10. Inside, Martha poured water and set the torn cloths beside it. Her hands were steady now. "You don't have to," she said, meaning the street, meaning the promise that would trade one life's quiet for another's noise. "I know," he said, "but I will." She didn't argue. She sat and laced her boots like a woman about to walk into a courthouse and tell the truth with no one to hold her hand. Then she stood and looked at him in a way that put weight on his chest, the way armor used to, heavy, protective, not meant for comfort. "Widow Sullivan will bring grace," she said. "Not today, when it's time." "Not today," he said. He cleaned the rifle again, though there was nothing to clean. He opened the Navy and closed it. He set the unfired .44 on the windowsill where the light took it up and made it a bright, dumb coin. He thought of the boy with the too big hat, of the wired bell wrapped in blue, of the chipped moon thrown away for a newer shoe. Warnings and taunts walk the same road sometimes. A man only knew what she'd been given by what came next. Toward evening, neighbors he didn't quite have began to drift over the ridge and then drift back as if they'd been sent to count fence posts. At the far edge of the property, the sheriff rode up and stared a long minute and left without speaking. The wind turned and came warm and carried the smell of town lamps being lit. Ash Hollow would eat early tonight and sit outside to see who had anything left to say. They ate stew they could not taste and bread that was not enough. Coyotes sent up their thin letters and got no answer. When the lamp was trimmed, the little house looked like a lantern set too far from camp. Martha pinned her hair up and then let it down and then pinned it again. He watched her and said nothing because there was nothing a mouth could do with a moment like that. "You sleep," he said finally. "I'll pretend," she said. He rolled the bedroll in the doorway with the rifle across his knees. Sometime after midnight, the windmill creaked a caution and then steadied. A rider came near and went by. He did not rise. He did not follow. Dawn would bring a straight road and a rule older than books. Just before first light, he stepped into the yard and faced east. The night was giving itself up slow. He spread his hand and saw the scar pale across the knuckles like frost on a fence rail. In the hush, he could hear a baby sigh in a house, not his, and a man's voice from years ago saying, "Hold him, boys, while the knife does what the bullet started." The past didn't speak much, but when it did, it spoke in that same hard voice that never cared who answered. He saddled the gray and cinched it down. He set the .44 back in his vest and closed the button. When he turned, he found Martha in the doorway, hair braided for riding or war. They stood a long heartbeat and did not touch. Because the one thing a man carries to a street like that is the knowledge of what he might not bring back. "I'll see you," she said. "You will," he said, and felt how far a promise could be from certainty. He swung up, and the gray found the road like it had been born knowing it. Over the ridge, town waited with its doors cracked and its windows breathing. The wind put dust in his mouth. He let it. Every step the gelding took put another word into a sentence he had been writing since the day the world first taught him what it cost to mend a broken thing. And when the sun lifted and burned the shadows down to a man's boot soles, he knew the silence on that street would be the purest he'd ever heard. Because some silences aren't made by fear at all, but by respect for the last sound a person means to make. The first wrong thing was the watch. The sheriff's nickel case hung open in his palm. No chain, no fidget, no cough. Only the thin insect tremor of the second hand crossing noon. And even that tremor could be seen instead of heard. Ash Hollow held its breath around that face of time and pretended not to see the boy with the too big hat standing on the livery porch rail, hat brim pulled so low it made his neck bend. Blue thread circled his wrist like a ribbon from a prize hog. The bell on Calder's latch would have stayed mute under such a ribbon. It had. Heat pushed down until boards groaned in their nails. Light came straight and merciless, shaved every shadow to a knife edge under boots and wagon tongues. Dust lifted without breeze, as if the earth couldn't help but speak and then lost its nerve. A horse stamped and shook a bridle chain, and the noise ran out of room and died. Calder stepped into the street with the rifle slung careful and the navy asleep on his hip. The .44 rimfire sat heavy in his vest, the bright dumb coin a man had left on his windowsill, carrying a promise or a dare. His mouth tasted like penny metal and old fire. He set his boots where they meant to be and found the line running through his spine that the war had taught him to stand upon. The scar over his knuckles went pale. Windows breathed. A dress hem drew back from a sill. Martha stood in the alley's shade, one hand on the wall, the other flat on her belly, like she could quiet the old ache with pressure. The air around her smelled of lye and pine and winter milk. Her eyes kept counting without numbers. 2 breaths, then 3, then begin again. A woman learns the measure of time by cries and silences. She listened for one and stood inside the other. Virgil came from the north end of the street with a rider's ease that wanted to be grace and only made cruelty smooth. New hind shoe on the bay, iron bright. The old crescent lie buried in some scrap bucket. Fitch rode a half-length behind, neat hands, a ledger kept inside his smile. Behind them, men with faces the color of gunstock and eyes that had learned to look away on command. The sheriff raised a hand and left it hanging in air. No word, no sermon, no law stronger than noon. Wind leaned on the telegraph wire and made it sing a note thin as thread. Somewhere a door latch clicked. The piano inside the saloon remembered it was missing a key and fell quiet out of shame. Calder eased breath through his teeth and let it out like he was sighting a long shot across a cornfield, before corn and before fields, when a boy learns steady from the weight of a borrowed rifle. Everything that had been said lay in the dust. The rest belonged to bodies and to God. Virgil's eyes were coins. He shifted the bay one step, shoulders squared, hat brim level with the horizon, like he believed the line belonged to him. In the corner of Calder's eye, the boy with the hat moved his wrist. Blue thread flashed once and was nothing again. Fitch's jaw ticked, a clock remembering it had work. Calder's left heel dug for purchase. The world narrowed to the space between a hammer and a sear. He could feel the leather creak under his palm, the insect drag of sweat down the inside of his forearm, the memory ache in his shoulder where a surgeon's hand had once gone searching. "Hold him, boys." A voice that wasn't here, and yet it was. His heartbeat found that slow soldier tempo count. Breathe. Don't rush your own burial. Martha's gaze held to the notch of Calder's hat, then slid to the white square of his vest where the .44 wrote. She remembered the weight of her child, the blue blanket, the stitched S. She put her back to the alley wall and didn't blink. If she blinked, the world might move. Hoof on wood, spur on stirrup, leather sigh. Heat pressed the smell of gun oil up out of coats and made ghosts out of old gunfire. The telegraph wire's note thinned and vanished. Virgil's hand twitched before his shoulder did. The bay's ear flinched. The muzzle tore daylight. No word, no count, no mercy. Smoke rolled out and folded back into the sun. The bullet stitched the air and bit splinters from the post by Calder's left hip, hot grit spitting his shirt. Sound hit a wall and came late, like thunder running after lightning. Calder was already moving without it. A step left, weight forward, slack taken up, front sight a dull square against a stripe of light on Virgil's chest. The rifle never asked permission. A squeeze, not a yank. The hammer fell. The stock kicked his shoulder. The world brightened and then narrowed to a single straight line that had nothing to do with roads. Glass rattled in its putty. A woman's hand flew to her mouth and then fought itself down. The sheriff's watch face shone white as bone. The boy on the rail leaned too far and caught himself with that blue-wrapped wrist. And somewhere in the tilt there was a secret nearly told and then swallowed. Martha's lungs forgot and remembered. The alley heat lifted off her skin and came down again. She saw the puff from Virgil's muzzle, the reach of it, the bright scrap of metal spitting off the post by Calder, the way dust flowers open around a body that stands still longer than wisdom allows. She didn't cry a name. The name was already in the air, carried thin along a wire, strung tight between two hands. Virgil staggered, or the light did. His hat shifted a finger's breadth. His pistol bucked again wild this time. Panic waking in a wrist used to slapping horses instead of aiming. Splinters jumped off a barrel. A crow on the church eave lifted and settled without opinion. Calder brought the Navy up for the clean second he might need, and felt the old ache slip into him the way cold slips into creek water, quiet and absolute. Another front sight, another line. He did not think of winning. He thought of being exact in a way that reckons a ledger down to the last seed grain and then puts the book away. The town leaned in. The wind stepped back. Somewhere far, hoofbeats ran down a road and did not arrive. Fitch shifted a half step to put himself between a future and a loss. The sheriff's hand didn't move. The watch's second hand found its mark and kept going because that was its entire religion. Smoke took the sun and gave it back. The street smelled like burnt caps and hot iron. The church bell did not ring. The only bell that had mattered had already been taught to lie. Calder's shoulder marked the recoil a second time, or imagined it. He could not tell. The sound folded itself into the open. Dust threw a veil over boot tops. In that veil, a hat fell, but it might have been only shadow. A knee buckled or a horse shifted. A woman blinked and broke the world and built it again. Martha's fingers dug into rough plank. Her vision narrowed to the space between two men and the breath that would belong to one of them and not the other. She tasted milk gone cold. She thought of a cradle that was not yet named for its owner and of muslin that made a bright square at night beside a bell that had been taught to be false. If the world wanted an answer, it would have to take it from the silence. Calder steadied into the shape the day had carved him for. Scar white on his hand, sun burning every shadow down to an honesty that hurts. He could feel every mile that had brought him here stack up behind his boots and push. Across from him, Virgil moved, or the smoke did, or the old god of dust and iron laid a hand upon the ledger and turned a page. The air held its breath and learned how heavy a heartbeat can be. And when the light settled just for an instant, just enough the street of Ash Hollow listened hard for the last sound a man means to make and waited to learn which name the silence would keep. The hat lay wrong, crown down in the dust, brim bent like a broken halo. Beside it, a drop of blood sat black as pitch in the white noon. Not running, not soaking, just deciding. The sheriff's watch clicked once, then twice, the sound too small for the heat. Someone breathed like they were learning how. Virgil was on one knee with his gun hand slack and bright red threading the fingers. The second shot, Calder's or God's had torn the pistol from him and pinned it into the street, Smoke feathered up and blew east, as if the world had chosen a direction and meant to keep it. A fly landed on the fallen iron and burned itself dumb. Fitch moved first. He shifted his boot a half pace and said, "Now," soft enough to sound like it wasn't orders. 3 of Virgil's men dragged leather and fired quick from the hip, more thunder than aim. The rounds tore splinters from a hitching rail and punched a hole in the mercantile sign. "Oh, like they were making a name for the day," someone shouted. The piano tried a chord and died of shame again. Calder felt the round pass where his hat brim had been a blink ago and caught the post with his shoulder. The Winchester cycled under his hand the way a well remembers water. He didn't think about the man on the end of the sight. He counted breath and drop and squeeze, lever and lift, and the first rider fell as if a string had been cut. The second bucked backward off his heels with the surprise of a man who believed only other men could be killed. The sheriff shouted, "Hold!" and didn't sound like a sheriff. His voice broke on the hard air and fell in pieces on the street. Fitch's mouth drew into a line you could measure fence with. He stepped sideways and pulled Virgil by the collar toward the bay. Not gentle, not brotherly. Ledger closing in his head as fast as he could turn the pages. Women pulled children backward into rooms where curtains had teeth. A bottle broke and spread sour whiskey across sun-hot boards. The smell came up with the smoke and made the air taste of old sin. From somewhere close, Mara, no, not a name, but Martha pressed her back flat, and her eyes set their mark on the man she had chosen to count. She did not pray. Prayers are for those who have decided they can bear an answer. The blacksmith came into the street with a sledge over his shoulder. No pistol, no coat. He swung once and made a horse think better of its rider. The rider pulled and found iron instead of reins and took his own fall hard. The shop girl from the mercantile stepped into view with cartridges cupped in her apron like eggs and flung them toward Calder. 2 cracked and rolled in the dust. 2 made the jump. He caught them without looking and fed the rifle by the feel. Widow Sullivan appeared in her shawl with a shotgun older than shame and snapped both barrels into the air for witness. "Enough," she said to nobody, and fired at the sky. The echo ran down both sides of Maine as if the town had a throat. Calder felt heat climb the back of his neck. He knew this place where a fight goes from 2 men and a ledger to a street and a tally no one meant to write. He took the center away from it. He stepped straight into the open so his shadow lay long and thin where anyone could see the shape they meant to shoot. "Virgil," he said. Not loud, not hateful, just the way a man says a name when he is taking it back from the mouth that spoiled it. Virgil looked up with the insult bleeding out of him. In that look, there was a kind of boy wild, spoiled, unafraid of debt, because he had never paid who had grown old without learning the price of a thing. His lips worked. The sun put tears into his eyes and called them sweat. He groped for the bay's stirrup with his left hand and found it like a drunk finds a door. Fitch yanked him high. Blood slung dark and flung small coins into the dust. 2 of the hired men tried to push along the saloon shade, boots soft, eyes hard, with the kind of courage men rent by the hour. Calder slid the navy up and cut the corner off that courage. One went down grabbing at air, the other stumbled sideways into daylight and met the blacksmith's sledge with his ribs. He lay where the town could see him and heaved like a bellows with a hole. The boy with the too big hat had climbed down from the rail. He held a carbine that might have been his father's or nobody's. Blue thread circled his wrist, new and neat. He brought the butt to his shoulder and pointed at a place near Calder's head and looked down the barrel like a man tries to read in a language he doesn't know. The sight trembled, then steadied, then trembled again. The sheriff saw him and shook his head once, slow. The boy's mouth opened. The gun sank. The blue thread flashed and went still. A lamp someone had left in the livery fell from a nail in all the shouting. It hit the floor and went to pieces, and the oil found straw. Fire petted the chaff with a warm hand, then seized it. A red tongue tasted the slat wall and asked for more. A horse screamed the way iron screams when it bends. Men swore into their wrists. The smell of kerosene and burning hair picked the town up by the back of its neck. "Buckets!" Widow Sullivan barked like she owned the river. Water flew, black and shining, and steamed when it met the new greed. Smoke rolled low and made every man bend. Through it, Fitch hauled Virgil through the mess and into the saddle. For a blink, Calder had the line on him, one square of sight, one clean ending, but the fire and the horse and the boy and the woman in the alley and the ledger of the day all leaned at once. And the moment slid. Calder took one step after and then stopped. He had learned the shape of a lost shot before. He turned that knowledge into something useful and took away the rest of the men. The rifle worked like a machine, a patient. God might build one shot to empty a hand, one to crack a wrist, one to bite a boot heel and turn a charge into dust. Guns went quiet one by one, the way coyotes go quiet when they remember wolves. Virgil's base shouldered through the smoke and found the clear. Fitch wheeled his own mount like he'd been practicing escape instead of a fence since breakfast. The two of them ran the north end and tore the day behind them like a nailed-down canvas. A rider with a red scarf tried to follow and met a post with his shoulder. The bay's tail whipped his face as it went past and left a mark. The sheriff at last found his voice where he'd misplaced it. "That's done," he hollered over the fire's talk and the echo of shots. "That's done enough." He was late, but not wrong. The blacksmith leaned on his sledge like a man who had hit noon hard and found a chair. Flames took the doorway of the livery and thought about the roof. Then the buckets and the river inside those buckets argued them down. Steam sizzled. Smoke softened. The horse stopped screaming as if it had decided to live. Someone laughed then, once, wild as a hiccup. Everyone heard it and nobody repeated it. Martha came out of the shadow. Her face had lost blood without losing color. She walked into the wet smoke and the ruin like a woman crossing a room she had scrubbed herself. She didn't look for Virgil. She looked for Calder and found him standing exactly where he had decided to stand, not moving because movement can invite a kind of collapse a body can't afford. He met her eyes. The noise slid away from them and left only breath. She set a hand on his sleeve, and that was all. The shop girl pushed cartridges back into their box and wiped her hands on her apron and stared at nothing, which is another way of staring at everything. The boy with the blue thread stepped forward as if to hand over the carbine, thought better, and lowered it, and worked at the knot on his wrist until it came free. He looked at the small ribbon like it might hiss, then dropped it into the water bucket, where it sank slow. He looked at Calder and then at Martha and then at the road the two men had taken. "I didn't," he started and stopped. Sometimes a boy's whole life can be the space between those two words. Widow Sullivan took the empty shotgun and broke it and reloaded like she was shelling peas. "They'll run west," she said to the ground. "They always run west when debt comes due." The sheriff stood with his hat in his hands and found the law written in the faces in front of him. He nodded to Calder as if to a man he'd been introduced to and never properly met. "It ain't over," he said, voice low and honest, and the town let that sentence stand. Wind moved and found the last of the smoke. The street gave up its heat by degrees. Ash stuck to wet wood and sketched gray birds' wings over the boards. Light lost its knife and became something a person could carry home. Calder walked to the dropped hat and turned it right side up with the toe of his boot. Blood had dried where the crown had been. He thought of a chipped moon buried in a blacksmith's scrap, of a bell tied dumb, of a cartridge left on a sill as a coin or a warning. He thought of how a town chooses itself in a single look that lasts as long as noon. Martha stood beside him and did not touch him again. The muslin square in her mind found a place to hang. Somewhere not far away, a baby sighed and turned, and he heard it in his bones, though the street heard only its own cooling. He lifted his head to where the road ran out of sight and knew he would spend another piece of himself on that distance. Ash Hollow settled. Flames turned to steam and steam to damp, and boots to tracks. A crow landed on the livery roof and peered at the ruin and seemed pleased with the day's record. Calder picked up the .44 from his vest and set it down on the hitching rail where the sun could find it easy. An unfired round, bright and dumb and patient. The town began to talk again because talk is what towns do when they have decided to live. And the sound went outward along the wire and the road and the wind, as if it might catch up to two men who had not yet learned the lesson that caught them in its teeth. And when the last bucket sloshed into dirt and the last gun clicked empty for comfort's sake, he knew the fight hadn't ended in the street so much as moved to the edge of the map, where dust keeps the names it's owed and waits for the men who promised them. The smoke at Widow Sullivan's place was the wrong color for morning thin and brown, not the clear blue that rises off a clean cook fire. The window curtain didn't stir, though the door was ajar, a hand's width. The goose kept quiet, neck tucked, as if it knew a better noise had just left the world. Calder reined in and felt the day hesitate under his boot. Martha went past him, fast and steady, her skirt brushing dust that had learned her weight. Inside the house, the air had turned sweet on one side and cold on the other. Sweet from bread gone too long, cold from a silence that would not warm again. Widow Sullivan sat in the chair by the hearth like a woman resting between tasks. The shawl had slipped off one shoulder. Her eyes looked toward the basket and didn't need to see to know. The heartbeat in the room was small and regular and innocent. The other one had gone where a ledger is not kept. Martha set a hand on the old woman's cheek. She closed the eyes with the same care she might fold the corner of a blanket. She didn't cry. Her breath came in deep pulls, not to keep herself from breaking, but to carry the work that had to be done. Calder stood with his hat in his hands and thought of the way a war ends, not in trumpet or flag, but in a body grown still in a room that smells of bread and lye. The baby stirred under the blue. The stitched S had fuzzed at the edges from so much washing. Martha slipped her fingers beneath the blanket and lifted the child to her shoulder. It was not triumph. It was gravity doing what gravity does, pulling what belongs into the hands made to hold it. The baby found the seam of Martha's dress and slept there with a new ease. Neighbors came and did the old duties with the old words. The shop girl brought a clean dress for the laying out. The blacksmith planed a plank for the box. The sheriff stood aside and kept his hat to his chest and said nothing a man would need to repeat. In the lane, the boy with the too big hat lingered with his hands lost in themselves. The blue thread was gone from his wrist. He didn't cross the threshold. He looked at the doorway as if it might name him, and then walked away slow. They carried Widow Sullivan to the ridge where the cottonwoods kept a small wind even on hot days. The ground gave up easy under the spade, better than a stony ground would have, as if it too had learned kindness. A cloud shouldered over the sun and opened a thin rain that barely reached the earth, more blessing than weather. It darkened the stitched letter on the blanket. It cooled the iron of the shovel's neck in Calder's hand. When the last shovel of dirt thudded and went flat, Martha stepped forward and set one palm upon the mound. "Thank you," she said plain, and it carried. They went home the long way because some miles need time to settle inside a person. At the draw, the windmill turned and complained and turned again. The bell over the latch chimed when the door opened, bright and honest. Inside, the muslin held the afternoon to a soft square and made a peace that didn't ask permission of anybody outside the fence. Grace woke and let the room know she was there. Martha sat with her in the rocker Calder had found at a farm sale and fixed with pegs. She hummed a sound that belonged to know him and everyone. The smell of bread, Widow Sullivan's last loaf, came with them in a cloth and filled the house with the notion that a life is built with small repeats. Wash, mix, lay, bake, draw water, set pegs, trim wick, check latch, sleep light, listen. Calder stepped outside and looked at the road. Not for fear, but for measure. Dust lay quiet in the ruts. A hawk rode air stiffer than it liked and made dew. Far west, thunder-shouldered mountains that a man could not see but could feel in his teeth. Word had come from a cowhand who wanted a drink and a listener that Virgil had ridden hard for the Platte and then took the deer pass toward the high country with Fitch in a tight line beside him. There were places a man could go and not be found by the law, and places he could go and not be found by himself either. The West holds both and asks no questions. The next week ran in the practical way that keeps grief from having too much of a mouth. Calder hung a wooden sign cut from cedar that used to be fence no paint, only letters burned in with the poker. Ash Hollow House. Not an inn, not a home, but both enough. Martha whitewashed the last of the low boards and scrubbed the floor until the pass sat down and behaved. Men passing on the cattle trail stopped for stew and coffee and didn't ask questions when their eyes measured the small bed by the stove and the cradle by the window. The bell on the latch learned to tell the truth in all weathers. At night, wolves wrote their thin lines on the ridge. Grace slept through them. Calder sat sometimes with the rifle across his knees and sometimes with his hands empty. He found he liked them empty better, though the habit of steel was strong in the bones. The scar on his knuckles was pale as ever. The ache in his shoulder waked in certain weather and then forgot itself. He took to planing cedar after supper, shaving long curls that smelled like old sun. The cradle took in the light and gave it back. Martha learned her own hands again. She baked 3 loaves at a time and kept one back for the road. She stitched a second blue blanket with a letter at the corner G and set it aside. She wore her hair up when she worked and down when the heat left and firelight could be afforded. She stood at the window sometimes and watched the road without waiting for anything in particular, which is a different kind of waiting and harder to judge. The boy with the 2 big hats showed on a Sunday when the air had gone high and thin as tin. He came without a gun. He didn't look at Calder. He looked at Grace and then at his own shoes like they needed mending and he didn't know how. "Mr. Boone," he said, and his voice was a scrape. "I tied that bell. He told me to. I left the shell too. Thought it was a joke till it wasn't." He swallowed. "They're gone. West. I don't know more than that." Calder nodded. "You got a name?" The boy colored. "EPH. As if that was half of something and he was waiting on the other half to find him. He scuffed the dust and lifted a hand as if to touch the cradle, then put it down. Martha pressed a heel of bread into his palm. He took it and held it with both hands and left like a man who had been given a small tool and hadn't yet learned its use. Summer leaned long. The wind used the telegraph wire for a fiddle and learned 2 notes. The sheriff started walking a different way down Main. The blacksmith added a bench in front of his shop and sat there some afternoons as if to say a man doesn't always need a reason. People began to take the long path past the draw and slow their horses and nod at the muslin square as if a house could put salve on a town. On the first rain that lasted long enough to change the smell of the dirt, Martha set the cradle by the window so Grace could watch drops ladder down the glass. Calder stood behind them with his hand on the sash and let the cool come in an inch at a time. Rain on this country doesn't apologize. It just does. The workmen can't. It beat dust flat and set a hair's width of green at the base of every blade of grass. It washed the powder smell out of old boards and took what it could from old wounds. After the rain, the air held a new clean that made the windmill sound like a faithful thing instead of a complaining one. Coyotes kept a respectful distance. That evening, Martha brought the lamp to the windowsill, and the flame found the muslin and made it glow. The room gathered itself and hummed. Outside, darkness stood and listened the way it always had, but the posture had changed. It wasn't only threat now. It was also a guest who had learned to knock. Calder went to the hitching rail and took up the unfired point, 4-4. He had set there the day Ash Hollow chose itself. He turned it in his fingers until the sunlight left it and the lamplight found it. He thought about the night a bell had been taught to lie and a boy had worn a ribbon he didn't understand. He thought about Virgil and Fitch riding some dry arroyo toward a map's torn edge, the ledger flapping like a loose shirt behind them. Then he put the round in a small tin on a shelf and closed the lid. A man shouldn't worship a warning. He should keep it. There is a difference. Martha laid Grace down and covered her with the new blue, the letter bright and crooked at the corner. She stood a long minute, hand on the cradle edge, and let the memory of the stall of her shame step closer and then back away. She looked at Calder, and he met the look. No speeches. Only the knowledge that two people had stood up in the same weather and kept standing. The night settled. The wolves wrote once and then held their ink. The bell hung easy in its frame. Far off, beyond the line a man can ride in a day, thunder muttered like a story being told to someone else. In the yard, cedar shavings lay like curled moons and smelled like what a home might be if a body tended it. Grace sighed and kicked the blanket and went still. Martha took the rocker slow, and the floor talked back in an old familiar tongue. Calder checked the latch and found it right. He stood at the door with the dark on his boots and the light at his shoulders and listened to the road that had given him all his hurt and a piece of his healing. The West would not grow soft. It did not need to. Sometimes a square of light was enough to argue it to a draw. He closed the door and let the bell speak for whoever came next. And the sound rang true in a way that carried, and kept carrying, long after the dust forgot the names that brought it there.